World War II is going to be our topic for today, specifically the United States' involvement in World War II. So for those of you that don't like battle and you don't like war, you may want to just hit fast forward until you see me stop talking. There is going to be a lot of military history involved with this, and in a lot of ways the United States is going to be kind of fighting two wars, both of them at the same time. One will be against the Italians and the Germans across the Atlantic and into Europe and North Africa on the one side, and then against the Japanese across the Pacific Ocean and into Asia on the other side. But we will spend a lot of time talking about what life was like here in the United States for most Americans who weren't actively fighting in this. But we do have to talk about the military events because they're going to really reshape world history and also, of course, the history of the United States. Following the bombardment of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Empire, you're going to see that this is going to provide a profound psychological shock to a lot of Americans in a way that few events could. One in perhaps more recent memory would be the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Not only is there a great deal of physical and human loss caused by this, but really there's going to be a great deal of psychological trauma to the point of even hysteria. And this is going to be the same thing that's going to happen here in December of 1941. It gets so bad, for example, at one point, just immediately following the Pearl Harbor attacks, the FBI received a phone call from a man in California that said that on the beach there was a dog. And the dog was barking in Morse code to a Japanese submarine that was just offshore. It seems kind of crazy that the dog would be spying on the United States from the Japanese, but that's kind of how people felt, at least in the initial aftermath of the shock of the Pearl Harbor attack, was that attacks could come from anywhere at any time, right? But after the Pearl Harbor attack, despite the great deal of public anger and outrage at Japan, there is a much larger world effort at stake here. And of course, Germany 3 days later is going to declare war on the United States. Thus, the United States and especially England are now very, very tight allies. And so Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill now are, for better or for worse, going to be the best of buddies. And despite the fact that a lot of the public was really leaning on sort of a campaign of vengeance against the Japanese for their sneak attack at Pearl Harbor, FDR says, no, look, we got to look at things here geopolitically. Hitler is actually the bigger danger, and he's the one that's going to cause more problems. If he were to conquer all of Europe, that would probably be an insolvable problem. If Japan conquers all of Asia, we may be able to find ways to get back at them. They're the weaker of the two threats. And so he declares that this U.S. strategy is going to be what's called Germany first, meaning that we're going to send resources to the Pacific, and they'll do okay, but our main effort is going to be concentrated across the Atlantic and into Europe to attack the Germans and defeat them first. Well, as this reaches to the average man and woman on the street, we're going to see that Americans are going to snap into line very, very quickly behind the war effort. This, of course, is going to involve a lot of people that they have really wanted to stay neutral. They perhaps have been part of the America First movement. Politically speaking, the Republicans that had been very critical of Roosevelt and the Democrats for trying to get too involved in what was going on with the war, they dropped their isolationist aspirations for the most part. They said, yep, we need to get involved with the war. We need to not play politics here with the war effort. You're even going to see these people that are descended from German and Italian immigrants. They were, even if they were immigrants themselves, an overwhelming majority of these people are, yep, we're pro-American, we're pro-war effort, we need to try to win the war. So what you're going to see is the nationalist reprisals of World War I, generally speaking, aren't going to be repeated against nationals or descendants of European foes here in World War II. Now, there is an exception to this, and that is with the Japanese people who are Japanese immigrants or people of Japanese descent. One of the things that the Washington authorities were extremely afraid of was that the loyalty of these people would be much more suspect, and they could serve as a possible hotbed for spies or saboteurs. And the reason for this, and I'm not trying to make excuses for the Roosevelt administration, but the reason for this is not just due to national origin or racial ethnic makeup, that kind of thing. The understanding here is that, for example, the Emperor of Japan was not just a political leader. Like you'll see, Hitler is a dictator. He's a political leader. The Emperor of Japan was also the leader, ostensibly, of the Shinto religion. And so, just because you move to the United States, it doesn't mean that you stop following what the emperor tells you, because he's your religious leader, at least ostensibly. So one of the worries was that when Emperor Hirohito tells, all right, we're at war with the Americans, all true loyal Japanese people, go after them, that isn't just a pep speech for his own political people, that it's also sort of a call out to all the people of Japanese descent living within the United States. And so, rightly or wrongly, FDR is going to sign an executive order that is often referred to as the Japanese Internment Act. And this is going to authorize the government to round up 110,000 Japanese of Americans, despite the fact that 2/3 of these people were not just resident aliens, but were actual U.S. citizens. So these are not just people that they find themselves in the United States and are waiting on citizenship. 2/3 of these people are actually full-fledged citizens of the United States, allegedly with full constitutional protections. We're going to see that that's not really the case. All right. So they're put into these internment camps. Now, it would be wrong to think that this is going to be the same kind of thing that you see with the concentration camps with the Germans, the work camps, the death camps over in Europe. Now, while it isn't the Bataan Death March, it still is oppressive to be forced into one of these, internment camps. But at the same point, okay, this isn't Dachau, right? There were little league baseball teams for the Japanese American children. They got mail service, and so it's bad, but it's not that bad. But it's bad. But it's not that bad. So anyway, that's what's going to take place here. But a lot of these Japanese Americans, they really wanted to prove their patriotism, that they weren't loyal to Japan, that they were loyal to the United States. And so a bunch of them are going to want to volunteer and to go off to fight. Now, due to one of the issues surrounding battlefield recognition, these guys are going to be sent to the European theater and for the most part fight in the Italian theater rather than sent over to the Pacific, because if you're fighting in the jungles of the Pacific Ocean and you see some Japanese guy staring back at you with a uniform, you may shoot first and then, oh, that was one of our Japanese guys, not one of the Japanese guys. So anyway, you would see a few of them go out in the Pacific to be served as interpreters and stuff like that. For the most part, in terms of combat, the Nisei Battalion is going to be sent over to fight in Italy. So these are some scenes here from the Japanese internment camps. Again, it's really not great. They're forced to live in these conditions, but at the same point, it's not that bad. They're not lining them up and shooting them left and right. So this is the 442nd Combat Team, the Nisei Battalion. This is all made up of these Japanese Americans who volunteered to go and fight against Axis forces in World War II. This is the highest decorated unit of any unit its size, a battalion-sized formation. They received more overall citations for individual valor and for unit valor of any formation in World War II. And so, generally speaking, they proved their worth to the United States. All right, so the United States is going to get into the war effort, and it brings a lot of assets to the table. You've got a big population that can now be added to the Allied side rather than the Axis side. You've got a massive industrial advantage, as the United States is the #1 industrial power in the world at the time. But the problem with this is, the United States doesn't come onto the field until halftime, and the other team has a big lead. So while they've got all these advantages, they're coming into this with the fact that Hitler's forces has conquered like 2/3 of Europe. Japan has conquered this huge oceanic empire, and so the United States is going to need to get going and hit the ground running before Germany and Japan can finish off conquering the rest of the world, and there aren't enough places that the United States can use to sort of strike back at these guys. So what you're going to see is Franklin Roosevelt, liberal, big government Democrat. He's not going to stop being a liberal, big government Democrat just because the problem has changed. Well, instead of the Depression as being his problem as president in the 1930s, the problem is going to be World War II in the 1940s. So you can take this guy out from one situation to the next, but his number of solutions in his sort of bag of tricks don't really change. And so government solutions have been what he had prescribed for the problems of the Depression, and the government solutions are going to be the prescription that he's going to use for the problems of fighting in the war. So what we're going to see is the government is going to regulate a huge amount of the U.S. economy. Now, one of the things that you've got to get going very, very quickly is the fact that all of this American industry, which for the most part is cranking out toaster ovens and cars and houses and all this kind of stuff for the U.S. civilian economy, is you got to get these guys producing war goods, right? We can't throw overalls at the Nazis and expect to win. So the government is going to halt all non-essential production and is going to pump $100 billion just in 1942 alone into this industry for war production. Okay, so the government is also going to do a number of other changes in order to reshape the U.S. civilian economy into the U.S. war economy. All right. One of the things they're going to do is ration food. The more food that the American public is going to buy on the market is going to create a price inflationary pressure that is going to cost the government more money to get food to get to the soldiers. And so this is something that they're going to ask people to, hey, you got to get a ration card. You can only get so much food per week. You'll get enough to eat, but you're not going to get a whole lot extra. Okay? It's going to regulate travel, not only gasoline, which is going to be rationed as well, but any spot that you have on an airline, on a bus, on a train. those are spots that you could be giving up to, travel resources that you could be giving up to use for soldiers. And so you would see these signs, these propaganda signs up in train stations and bus depots all across America. Is this trip really necessary? Do you really need to do this? There's going to be pretty strict control over wages and prices of a lot of items, and also of a lot of industrial workers at various factories who are under government contracts. And so this is designed to keep inflation in check. And generally speaking, the government's going to do a really good job considering how much cash they pump into the economy, that there isn't spiraling inflation during World War II. One of the things that they do is they're very interested in making sure that farmers keep producing large amounts of food to keep the prices of food for the soldiers down as far as possible. They're also going to ask citizens to recycle, not for the purposes that you and I might today, such as, well, we got to protect the environment and that kind of thing. They're going to take a lot of these items like paper and leather and used cooking oil and nylon and things like that, and they're going to recycle them into military items. And we're going to see a number of propaganda campaigns for these specific programs, or just the overall idea that we need to go out and we need to start killing some Germans and Japanese and Italians. So this is one that's designed to give you an idea, well, what are we fighting for, right? This is often referred back to the pre-war speech that Franklin Roosevelt gave called the Four Freedoms speech. And, if you want to distill what America is kind of down to and what they're fighting for: the freedom of speech, the freedom to worship freely, the freedom from want so that the government doesn't come in and take all your stuff, and a freedom from fear. And here's some good ones, right? This one is about rationing for food. Do with less so they'll have more. This is the they that they're talking about with this soldier. Rationing gives you your fair share. And the idea is the less that you eat, the more the soldiers can have. And this is a good one, right? When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. And so there's the ghost Hitler. The idea is that if you're riding around without being in a carpool, that you're wasting gasoline resources, and that only helps the Nazis. One of the ways that the United States sought to offset the cost of the war was to get people to voluntarily give money to the war effort through what they call the war bonds. You can only raise taxes so much before you have a crushing effect on the economy, and of course that's something the United States doesn't want to see happen, is the economy gets squished right in the middle of a world war. So you get people to buy this war bond, and this was one of these charts that, give as much as you can for the war effort, and then once the war is over, the United States government would pay you back. And so this was something that you would see here. And of course, you're inspired there by Uncle Sam, who's carrying the flag of the United States forward with fleets of planes in the sky and hordes of soldiers on the ground to buy war bonds. And of course, the war bonds would keep the Nazi shadow of the swastika away from them, away from your children if you buy war bonds. All right. So this is one way to get sort of the manpower of America moving. But we also need to talk a lot about the woman power of the United States, because the United States is going to be extremely effective at mobilizing its woman power, because huge numbers following the Pearl Harbor attack of young men, they're going to volunteer. They're going to volunteer in huge droves, lines around the block of people that are going to try to join the military. The United States government is also going to supplement this with the draft. Right? They're going to draft huge numbers of young men. So you've got big gaps in America's civilian industries, because as these men are leaving to go and join the military, somebody's got to come in and fill these jobs. And this isn't just for a simple economic reason. This is also for the reason that somebody's got to produce all these bombs and planes and uniforms and boots and stuff like that. So that way we can have all the resources that we need in order to fight a modern technological war. To this end, the United States is going to turn to some underemployed sectors of the U.S. workforce. One is going to be African Americans. And one of the major barriers to full employment of African Americans have been racial opposition. A lot of white workers, we don't want to work with these guys. And of course, a lot of white-owned companies, well, we're not going to hire these guys. It's going to create a discipline problem. And so what you're going to see is the U.S. government is going to try, throughout, especially the second half of the war, to try to foster interracial cooperation, right? Through the United We Win campaign. And so this is only going to continue to stimulate more and more African Americans to move to these industrial cities to try to find industrial work, which from their end is, of course, going to be higher paying jobs, right? But what we're going to see is the most dramatic influx of this is going to be from women. 6 million women are going to join the workforce, and this is going to be actively encouraged by the government. And so women also were not only encouraged to join the workforce in industrial capacities, which generally speaking women, you just wouldn't have found hardly any women in industrial labor prior to this, but women were also encouraged to openly join the military. Now, they were assigned to non-combat roles, and the idea was that you would free a man to fight. So you get a job in the military being sort of the typist, you're the secretary here at headquarters, and that's a man now that he can put the typewriter down and go pick up a rifle and go shoot some Nazis. And that's the idea behind this. But women, when you put them near the front lines, they're going to get in some harrowing situations. Artillery strikes, air attacks. There are going to be a lot of women, for example, that are nurses at Pearl Harbor that are going to be hit in the initial attack. And so this is going to be pretty dangerous stuff for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And so here you can see some of the iconography, the propaganda of World War II, right? Victory waits on your fingers, right? You're going to fight her war job, and she's helping out with the United States. One of our most famous icons is Norman Rockwell, who gives us Rosie the Riveter, who's trying to challenge this idea that just because you get some war job that you're going to lose your femininity. Right, Rosie, she's dirty. She's got some big muscles from hefting around her Bolt driver, right? She's eating her lunch, and she's got her hair done up in her little bonnet, and she doesn't care, right? She's helping the United States, and she is going to do what she's got to do, and this was the form of encouragement of this. So a little bit less aggrandized, though, but these are some women industrial workers that were out in California helping to build airplanes, and this is them on their lunch break and what they look like, helping out the U.S. Industry, right? This is from the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, designed to recruit women. And of course, this is from the Marine Corps, who bring in women for various non-combat functions. And you can see the slogan down at the bottom, free a man to fight. All right? Now, what you're going to see in the African American community is an interesting sort of response to World War II. Because World War I had seemed to be one of these great patriotic moments that a lot of the leaders of the African American community said, all right, we need to get on board with World War I. And this will prove to a lot of white Americans that black Americans are just as patriotic and just as hardworking and hard fighting as anybody else. And then that will help end racial segregation and this second-class citizen status that we're suffering through. And they would go out, and they would kick butt in the factories, they would kick butt on the battlefield, and they would do everything that they could as a result of that. And they come back, and in the 1920s, you're hit with one of those racist decades in American history, if not the most racist decade in American history. And so when World War II rolls around, and of course the U.S. government sort of reaches out to the black community and, hey, we really need you guys to pitch in and help out. I don't know about this. This is going to be a much cooler reception, okay, as a result of the experiences that they had during the First World War. And so what you're going to see is President Roosevelt and a lot of people around him, well, not everybody around him, they knew that if they were going to get African American support, that they were going to have to do something about some serious progress on racial issues, specifically about segregation. So what you're going to see is the government is going to start instituting some programs to stimulate economic integration. There's going to be an interesting rift in the Roosevelt administration because you're going to have some of these guys that are, yeah, we really need to move towards racial integration. And then you have some of these guys that are pretty hardcore segregationists. You got to remember, these guys are Democrats here in the 1940s. No, I don't think so. And so there's not going to get a very even response as far as all this. What we're going to see is, while there is some social progress, we're also going to see that blacks are still placed in segregated units. They're mostly used for non-combat roles because to give combat roles to African Americans is to imply a certain sense of honor. But we will see that there is going to be a series of experiments dealing with this. Most notable here is the Tuskegee Airmen. This was an all-African American fighter squadron, and their job through most of the war was to protect, they would fly cover for bomber formations that were flying into Germany to bomb the Third Reich from the air. And they had a 100% success rate. They never lost a bomber to enemy fighter planes. No other unit could claim that. And so their designation was, or their unit identification was the tails of their planes were painted red, so that way they could tell who was in their squadron in the air and who wasn't. And the Germans didn't know that black guys were flying the planes, but they had developed such a respect for these guys because they kept getting shot down by them that they referred to them as the red-tailed devils. And so this proved to a lot of people, finally by the end of the war, that not only could black people fight, but they could fight in a highly technological style of warfare, such as aerial warfare. And in fact, they could go on and they could be the best at this. Okay. Now, what you're going to also see is the segregation that takes place on land. All right. A lot of these commanders towards the end of the war, you're starting to see some pretty heavy casualty rates in some of the white combat units. And even guys like George Patton, who was from the South, started saying, this whole racial segregation thing is kind of stupid. You know, we got white guys that are taking pretty heavy casualties, and we got black guys that want to fight, and I'm supposed to not allow this to happen. But of course, okay, why don't you guys go on in and fight if you guys want to fight? And so ever increasingly, a lot of the frontline units are hey, you guys go in and you go fight if you want to. Just don't tell anybody in Washington. And so finally, you'll just even see some of the commentators saying that the only people who really have problems with this aren't the white guys at the front. They're not the black guys at the front. It's the guys in Washington that think that this is going to be chaos if we let white guys and black guys fight alongside each other. Okay? And so by the end of the war, you're going to see a lot of thawing on these issues. And in fact, World War II would be the last war that the United States would fight using racial segregation in its military. And so this is the United We Win campaign, where you got a black guy, you got a white guy, you got the American flag, and they're both working on the same aircraft engine, and it doesn't matter that their skin is different colors because they're all united around the purpose of victory. One of our great success stories in World War II is this guy, Dory Miller, who was a messman, which means he was in the cook/cleanup staff on board one of these battleships here that was at Pearl Harbor. Because he was black, he was not allowed to be a member of the regular part of the crew. They were only allowed to, work in the laundry detail, to swab the decks and clean up the mess hall and stuff like that. And what happened was, when his ship was being attacked on December 7th, he didn't have anything to do because the mess hall was, I guess, pretty clean. And so he ran up to where the gun crews, the anti-aircraft gun crews, they were cowering behind the places on the deck because they were too scared to come out and fight. And so he kind of yells out, "Hey, you guys need to get on the anti-aircraft gun and shoot at these Japanese planes." And they're like, "No, man, I don't think so." So he gets up. He has had no training on how to use this thing, all right? Because he was going to be he's going to be working in the cafeteria. And so he's like, "How do you use this thing?" And they tell him, and okay, you cock it, and then you point, okay, fine. And he starts going to town on the Japanese. He shoots down at least one Japanese plane, which, considering the fact that they're going a couple hundred miles an hour at least, is pretty impressive. And he, you guys want to help out? No, they just keep passing him more ammunition, and he reloads it and he keeps firing. Apparently, Miller gets so worked up into this kind of thing that as the ship continues to get hit and starts sinking, eventually he's up to his ankles in water as the ship is literally sinking out from underneath him, and he's continuing to fire at the Japanese. They finally like, "Okay, dude, we've had enough. You guys need to get out of here." They actually have to pull this guy off of the gun. He receives the Navy Cross for valor here at the Battle of Pearl Harbor. These are some guys, the Tuskegee Airmen. This is them in a pre-flight briefing, and this is them, their job through most of the war, flying P-51 Mustangs, painted with that red tail that I mentioned, and they're flying cover over the bombers. And so the idea was that when the German fighters would come up to try to shoot down the bombers, these guys go after the German fighters and keep them off of the bombers, because of course these bombers are big, slow-moving kind of targets, and so this is going to keep them away from American assets. And this is an African-American soldier. This is him fighting out in the Pacific Ocean, which he really probably wasn't supposed to be doing, but by the end of the war, you're going to see that ever increasingly these guys are going to find themselves in harm's way. All right. What you're going to see here when we talk about the military history and the military campaigns is I'm going to deal a little bit with the Japanese theater, the Pacific, and then I'm going to kind of get finished with that, and so that way I'm not bouncing back and forth between theaters because these different things are going to be happening in different places. I'm going to, for the most part, deal with the war in Europe from beginning to end, and then we'll kind of come back here to the war in the Pacific against Japan. And that, like I said, it's just less confusing to do that, although you have to go forward in time and then kind of back in time a little bit. So I'm going to start with Japan, then we'll deal with Europe, and then we'll get back to Japan here in a second. All right? Well, for those of you that are like, "Man, Japan they're idiots." Okay, you got tiny little Japan, and they're going to attack the United States, and they're sort of like throwing rocks at a hornet's nest because the United States is huge, and they're going to come after the Japanese. All right, the Japanese weren't total fools about this. The Japanese military planners that were saying we need to go forward with this attack on the United States, they understood that if they were going to win the war, they'd have to win it very, very quickly. Because the longer the war went on, the United States could mobilize its manpower, its industrial forces, and all of its military, and just come after Japan and grind it into power. So the idea here, part of it was based on the success of what they hoped would happen at Pearl Harbor, which for the most part did. Because the U.S. fleet is going to be a smoking ruin in Hawaii. It doesn't matter how many guys you have. If you don't have the Navy that can get them to all the islands that are going to make up the battlefields of the Pacific theater in World War II. So as a result of that, for the initial 6 months of the fighting, Japan is going to have naval superiority. Their Navy is going to be the dominant Navy in the Pacific, and thus they're able to land large numbers of troops all throughout the Pacific. They're going to conquer very, very rapidly a lot of these places, and they're going to amass a huge oceanic empire that's going to include American bases that are going to get taken over at Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Burma from the British, and then also Indonesia. They're going to attempt to then invade Australia. Now, Australia is sort of America's last kind of bastion in the South Pacific. Australia was still part of the British Empire at this point, and the United States understands that it's got to try to stop this invasion. The Brits are going to take, or the Japanese are going to take off here with their ships all loaded down from Indonesia, and they're going to start heading towards Australia. The United States is going to send a fleet to interdict these guys, but of course it's badly weakened after the bombings that take place here at Pearl Harbor. And so the United States and the Japanese navies are going to meet at this battle that takes place off the northeastern coast of Australia at a place called the Battle of the Coral Sea. Interestingly enough, this is the first naval battle that is fought entirely with aircraft, launched from aircraft carriers. This was something that not a lot of people thought, is this the way of naval warfare in the future? Planes just sort of trying to bomb each other's fleets? Is that really going to work? And it turns out that, yeah, this is a lot of the battles in World War II are going to be fought in this manner. But this is the first one where the two opposing fleets never catch sight of each other. They have to fight each other using aircraft completely. So this line here gives you an idea of kind of the extent of Japan's overall empire. And of course, this is all conquered within like a 6-month period. So a massive, massive area. This little highlighted red area gives you an idea of kind of how far out the Japanese empire is going to very quickly happen. This is a zoom in. This is Australia down here, and this is the Coral Sea. These guys are coming down from New Guinea in Indonesia, and then this is where the battlefield is going to take place off the northeastern coast. And these are the bombings that are going to take place. This is a painting done from the perspective of American bombers that are winging away from one of these Japanese carriers that have been hit and set on fire. And so this is a dive bomber attack from a gun camera. This is of the Shikaku, a Japanese carrier that's hit here in May of 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea that is put out of action. Okay, and so the Battle of the Coral Sea technically is a draw, but strategically is a massive win for the United States because the Japanese would lose more, the United States would lose more ships, but the Japanese would lose more planes. And the reason, though, it's a strategic victory for the United States is Japan has to turn around as its ships are now out of fuel from fighting the battle, and they have to go back, and they can't maintain the invasion of Australia like they wanted to. So this is it's a victory for the United States, but it's not one that's going to completely shift the fighting here in the war. The Battle of Midway, however, in June of 1942 is going to be one that's going to do this. All right, and actually the catalyst for the Battle of Midway is going to be the Doolittle raid. All right, and one of the things that the United States was seething with rage about was the Pearl Harbor attack. There's got to be some way for us to strike back at Japan, hit them where they are. But airplane technology here in the early part of 1942 made this a sketchy possibility at best. But one of these American airmen was a guy named Colonel James Doolittle, and he said, I think we can do this. What we'll do is we'll take some of our medium-sized bombers, and we will strip them down with armor and guns and stuff like that as much as possible, and make them as light as we can, and we'll take them out on an aircraft carrier, and we'll sail as close as we dare to get to Japan, and then we'll fly over them and bomb them from the air. We probably won't do a whole lot of damage, but we'll scare them, and then hopefully we can have enough fuel to land in parts of China that Japan has not conquered yet. So this is the plan. This is the Doolittle raid, all right? And it works, all right? These guys fly over Japan. They buzz low over the Emperor's Palace just to let them know that they're there. And they don't do a lot of physical damage. And some bombs go off here and there in Yokohama Harbor. But for the most part, it's just a psychological blow. But it is one that is extremely effective. The Japanese didn't believe that they were within the U.S.'s striking range, and they start figuring out, okay, where did these guys come from? How did they get here? And they say, well, they were probably on an aircraft carrier. What was the aircraft carrier using it as a base? And that was Midway Island. Midway Island gets this name because it's halfway between Japan and Hawaii. And so the Japanese said, well, if Midway Island is their base for bombing us, we got to take it out. We got to take it out, all right? And so they begin putting together an operation to attack and capture Midway Island. By this point, though, just a little bit before this, the United States they'd been receiving all of these Japanese coded messages, all right? And the Japanese, they would broadcast these messages in between their various military units. And the United States would get them, but they're all in code. And they couldn't read them. And, blah, 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 blah. What does that mean? I don't know, okay? And they've been working on trying to crack the code. So just before the Battle of Midway, they had managed to crack the Japanese military code. And so they basically are reading, hey, I think they're going to Midway Island. So the United States fleet has the advantage of the fact that they know where the Japanese are going to be, and the Japanese don't know that the Americans are going to be there. However, there's not that much left of the U.S. fleet. All right, a lot of it got wrecked in the fighting here at Pearl Harbor, and a lot of it is going to get badly damaged at the fighting around Coral Sea. And so the United States has kind of all of its eggs in one basket, that it's going to gamble on this one last throw of the dice, that it can ambush this Japanese fleet and make up for the numerical superiority with surprise. Well, the United States' reconnaissance planes are going to catch sight of the Japanese fleet here on June 3rd, 1942. And this is going to begin a massive naval battle, again, fought entirely by aircraft. Japanese ships and American ships aren't going to shoot directly at each other. They're going to launch aircraft, and they are going to be the ones that are going to fight back and forth. What we're going to see here is because of once the Japanese figure out where the Americans are, they're going to start launching bomber strikes against the United States fleet, and there are going to be some pretty serious losses. And through most of the day, the United States is going to be catching the worst of this. But we're going to see that just at the pivotal moment in the battle, a squadron of U.S. dive bombers is going to catch a big, big break. A whole bunch of things go badly wrong for the Japanese, really all at once. First of all, one of the things that had happened was the Japanese had loaded most of their planes with bombs because they were anticipating not fighting the U.S. fleet, which they didn't know was there. They were going to go in and they were going to bomb Wake Island. So they load their planes down with bombs. And then all of a sudden they figure out, hey, the U.S. fleet is here. So they need to switch the bombs for torpedoes, which of course, airplanes, they drop the torpedo in the water, and it runs in the water, and it hits the side of the ship, all right? And so this was something that was particularly problematical for the Japanese admiral because it takes a long time to take the bombs off the plane and then put it down in the storage facility down in the ship and then pull the torpedo up from its storage facility and fit it onto the plane and get them to take off again. And so what they decided to do was cut some corners. They're just going to stack the bombs up on the deck, which would greatly cut down the amount of time that it's going to take to rearm the planes. So you've got all these Japanese bombs that are sitting around on the deck of their plane, on the deck of their aircraft carriers. The second thing that happens here is this U.S. dive bomber squadron that it was kind of lost in the clouds. All right, this is an era where you don't have computer navigation, you don't have radar in these planes. They've got to go completely off of sight-based navigation. All right, just at this moment, there's going to be a break in the clouds. And these guys just happen to be right over the Japanese fleet. Now they know exactly where they are. Oh, there they are. And as they start diving on these Japanese planes, or Japanese carriers, Japanese fighter planes, what they would do is they would fly what's called combat air patrol, as high cap, where they stay up pretty high over the carriers, and anybody that comes down and tries to attack their ships, they dive on them, they shoot them down before they can get there. A U.S. torpedo bomber squadron, which they have to fly very low to the surface, all right, had just tried to attack these guys. And so the Japanese planes had gone down very close to the surface of the water to shoot these planes down from the United States, just as these dive bombers are coming through. So what that means is the Japanese planes that could kind of stop them, instead of being back where they would be, as they had been a few minutes before, and could be again a few minutes later, they're stuck down very close to the surface of the water, and it's going to take them a while to climb back up to get to where they can stop these guys. So all of that combines together, okay, into one big, big problem. And we're going to see that these U.S. bombers, when they break through the clouds, they're going to hit these four main Japanese fleet carriers, and their decks are all loaded with these bombs. So not only do they do the damage that the American bombs are dropping on the decks here, but now all of the other ancillary explosions that take place. The Japanese are going to lose 4 of their carriers in this battle that are either going to be sunk or so badly damaged that they're not going to be able to use the rest of the war. And the reason that this is important is because these 4 carriers are really irreplaceable. Japanese industry are not going to be able to crank out 4 more aircraft carriers in time to be in the rest of the war. The United States is going to lose 2 carriers. However, the United States would be able to build more aircraft carriers. And what we're going to see here is as a result of this, the tide in the Pacific had turned in the United States' favor. If you want to use a football analogy for this, the Japanese, they have the ball. All right? They have the ball up until the Battle of Midway. And then from that point forward, we're going to see that either an interception or a fumble or whatever, and the United States is going to get the ball from them. And the United States is going to go from defense to offense as a result of the Battle of Midway. This is Jimmy Doolittle's plane. He's taking off from this carrier. They're going to go over and they're going to bomb. They're going to bomb Japan, and this is Yokohama Harbor from the gun cam of Doolittle's plane. You can see it down below. And of course, the Japanese, no way Americans could bomb us. Oh, yeah, I think they can. And so this is video game footage from a Battle of Midway video game, which proves you can learn a lot from playing video games if you know what you're looking for. And this gives you an idea of kind of what's going on. These dive bombers, they break down and they start hitting these Japanese carriers. This is an artist painting of what these would have looked like. The dive bombers pulling away from blasting these carriers in the background. This is the USS Lexington that is hit by a Japanese bomber. It eventually would sink as a result of this, and so the United States is going to lose both of its carriers, but the Japanese are going to lose 4, and these are 3 of the 4 carriers on fire in a diorama here from 1942. So the United States, they have the ball, right? They have the ball, but the problem is they're now faced with an enemy that's entrenched on thousands of islands all throughout the Pacific, and the Navy that the Japanese have is not as strong as the United States Navy after the Battle of Midway, but it still can cause a lot of problems, all right? So the plan here for the Japanese is actually not a bad one, all right? It's actually not a bad plan. The idea here is you bleed the Americans as they have to fight their way through all these different islands that you're on, and they're going to have to attack them from the water, and you can send your Navy out to kind of strike at these guys. You know you're not going to be able to win and conquer them, but you can make the war just so bloody and so nasty, and if you're willing to fight to the death, which apparently the Japanese were willing to do, you're just going to make the war so expensive that they won't have the manpower to kill you all. It's not a bad idea. The United States is going to respond to this by adopting a different strategy called island hopping, all right? And what they're going to do is instead of attacking all the islands that the Japanese are on, they're only going to pick out the key ones that they actually have to have, and they're going to leapfrog their way closer and closer to Japan. They're going to bomb airfields and naval stations that can hit them, and then anybody that's entrenched on an island they don't need, they just leave them there. They bypass these, all right? The islands that have key air bases or other facilities that they need, they'll send in the Marines, they'll send in the Army to go, and there'll be some bloody, nasty fighting as a result of that. But once they capture these, they'll then have air cover out to a certain distance. And then they'll advance as far as they could under their air cover, take a new air base or build a new air base, and then advance very far. And then all the islands that are in between, you're just going to leave them there. You're going to let the Japanese rot there. A few of them would rot there as late as the 1970s because they don't all get policed up. But when you look at, that sounds great, and strategy is easy to come up with, but somebody's going to have to actually execute it, all right? And that means that the Marines and these Army guys are going to have to go and make amphibious landings, which means you've got to attack these guys and cross the open water and attack beaches that are held by the enemy, and then fight their way through these Japanese soldiers that are dug into caves, bunkers, and into the jungle. And generally speaking, the Japanese refuse to surrender. They just fight to the death. Honor in Japanese culture, the way of Bushido, right, is something that is hammered home into these guys, and they just don't surrender. They just fight to the death. Okay, so the United States throughout this period is going to fight very hard for places like Guadalcanal, the Marianas, Saipan. But by 1944, the United States had really pushed the Japanese back to a line of Iwo Jima and the Philippines. They had managed to do this through some really, really difficult fighting. So this is all the fighting that's going to take place throughout. This is often referred to as the slot of the Solomon Islands. Of these guys that are sort of fighting on all of these islands. And this is what you would see here. This is fighting here in Saipan in mid-1944 as Americans are going forward, and one of these guys is going to go down because he's hit by a cyclone. And so this is pretty difficult fighting once you get inland, and then once you go into the jungle, this is what you see. Where are the Japanese hiding? These guys are all in here, so this is incredibly difficult kind of stuff for these soldiers. And the jungle itself is as much of an enemy as the Japanese are, where you've got rot, and you've got fungus, and you've got hot conditions, you've got poisonous snakes, you've got a great deal of difficulty. This is a column of American soldiers as their guys are taking a break, as they're going through the fighting, trying to find these Japanese guys. Difficult, hot conditions. You can see these guys, their shirts unbuttoned, and so this was really, really difficult stuff that these guys are having to put up with. All right, and so this is the fighting as it goes forward in the Pacific. And so by 1944, they've got the situation much improved than it was 2 years before. All right. Well, U.S. entry into the war against Hitler, though, in the European theater, means that really the noose is tightening around the German forces, which are ever increasingly spread pretty thin. But one of the problems, of course, that the United States is going to have is the fact that all of its forces are in North America, and its enemy is in Europe. And there's the Atlantic Ocean that are full of German submarines in between. And so this is a major, major source of consternation because the Germans are pretty adept at sinking vessels here in World War II. Fortunately for the United States, a number of technological advances is going to tip the balance of the fighting here in the Battle of the Atlantic in their favor. One of them, of course, is being aircraft that can be launched from these small aircraft carriers, but also boat planes. and they can see a lot of these submarines, even if they're up to about 50 feet of water. They're pretty easy to see. Radar, which we normally think of, you send that out and you see like planes in the sky, but also a very tiny little periscope or a little conning tower that you might miss on the horizon with binoculars. Radar is going to pick that up. You're also going to see code breaking of the German military code of Ultima is going to give these guys a good idea of where some of these U-boats are going to be sent because they're reading their orders at the same time that the U-boat captains are. And then the high-frequency detection finder, the HFDUF, it allows you to triangulate a burst transmission. So when you get two ships with one of these things on and a U-boat off in the distance sends a transmission to say, hey, I found a U.S. convoy, other U-boats need to come to where I am, U.S. ship, is over there, and you get a pretty good idea of where he's going to be. All of this here is that by the latter part of 1943, the United States is basically able to drive the U-boats out of the Atlantic Ocean. And what that means is they are going to open up these sea lanes to massive U.S. shipment of troops, material, gasoline, all the stuff that you need to fight in a war. Not only are we going to see fighting on and under the water, but also in the air as well. One of the sides of the strategic part of this is really, a lot of people were saying that now we've got aircraft that can go fairly long distances and can carry fairly heavy loads. We think that we can bomb the Germans into submission. All right? And this is something that we still use today in our military, is the ability to drop bombs on somebody from a very long distance away. We've gotten a lot more effective and precise with it. But these guys are going to be trying this really for the first time on a massive scale in the Second World War. And for the most part, the idea is the United States is going to be targeting German heavy industry. You're going to try to find some, aircraft factory, some ball bearings plant, an electrical production facility, railroad depot, something like that, to try to crush the German war economy, the ability to make tanks and gasoline and stuff like that. The British, generally speaking, they bombed at night, whereas the United States tended to bomb during the daytime. And since it was harder to see at night, the British tended to bomb more saturation bombing of it, just blow up a city. And that'll reduce the number of Germans, that'll cause a psychological, blow against them. It'll kill the number of workers in the factories, and so anyway, that's typically kind of what you're going to see. What we're going to also see here is the idea is as the Luftwaffe comes up to try to fight the Americans and the British, the more of them you shoot down, the less of them that will be available later for when the land campaigns open up, right? When the United States gets involved in the fighting, one of the major fronts here for the fighting was in North Africa. And we're going to see that finally the British 8th Army is going to halt the German Africa Corps, the Deutsche Afrika Korps here, from moving on into the Middle East. So they managed to hold these guys away from the oil fields of Iraq and Saudi Arabia and places like that. And they managed to kind of hold the line. But really the main turning point in the war isn't going to involve the United States at all. And it's going to be in the Eastern Theater, where the Russians and the Germans have been going at it since June of 1941. And finally, this drive that the Germans had into southern Russia is going to be halted and completely reversed due to the tenacious fighting around the city of Stalingrad. The Germans eventually, they get bogged down in this kind of city-urban kind of warfare, which they're not very adept at. The German war machine is more of a speed, kind of thing. You go through open fields and open territory and you cut off the enemy, as opposed to, street by street, block by block kind of fighting. It's not really their kind of thing. And what that meant was the Russians now had time to rush reinforcements to Stalingrad and eventually would launch a counterattack that would surround, it would sort of break through and surround the German 6th Army that was now trapped in the part of Stalingrad that they had captured. All in all, during the fighting here in and around Stalingrad, in terms of kill or capture, the Germans are going to lose 300,000 men during the battle. And you start looking at, okay, that's a lot of guys, all right? Well, there were only 3 million men that the Germans had on the entire Eastern Front. So what that meant was 1 out of every 10 German soldiers disappeared from the front between the Germans and the Russians due to the Battle of Stalingrad, to put that into kind of perspective. So this is what you see in the newsreels with great victories. These are U-boats that are being sunk. This one's being blown halfway out of the water. This one is exploding as it's fairly close to the surface. These are what these bombers would look like if you were up in one of these and you're watching these bombs, just sort of raining out of these American bombers, hitting some factory or something below. This is from a video game, Bombing the Reich, and you can see how difficult this would be with the Germans, shooting back here for the American 8th Air Force. This is Erwin Rommel, right? And he's from the seat here of his Panzer III tank. And this is them in the sands of North Africa. Very, very successful, driving the British backwards, until finally, here at the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Brits are going to stop them and eventually would reverse the fighting. And it gets pretty close. As you can see, the Germans, they kind of wrap around the flanks here, and they almost can break through. But the fighting here along Kidney Ridge eventually would stop the Germans' advances. And this is a knocked-out Panzer IV tank that they recovered in the desert sands. And this is the fighting. These are some Russian soldiers here in the three pictures here, fighting in the streets of Stalingrad. And of course, the poor Germans, you know, they're really out of their element with the fighting that takes place here in the city, and eventually they would be surrounded, pinched off on two sides. This is the German 6th Army, its position on the map. And this is the scene in February of 1943 of about 100,000 German prisoners. Of the 300,000 Germans that would be engaged at Stalingrad, a couple of 100,000 of them are going to die. 100,000 of them are going to be taken captive, and of that 100,000 captives, only 15,000 are going to survive the rather brutal Russian POW camps. All right, so a lot of this is going to happen here without, you know, especially the fighting on land, without U.S. involvement. And so by the autumn of 1942, the United States finally has enough of its forces ready to begin to pitch in to this. And of course, their plan here is they want to just go right at the Germans. Okay, you know, most of our forces, we can start sending them over to England, and you got England, you got Germany, so you just, you know, point a straight line. That means we're going to have to land on the shores of German-occupied France. And of course, the Brits are like, whoa, no, the Germans are dangerous. All right. What we need to do, we fought them here, we got thumped in 1940, and you got to be careful with these guys, because if you go right after them, they will kill you. So we need to go for a little more oblique approach. All right? They convinced the American military planners, what we'll do is we'll stop her up the German Africa Corps here in Egypt, and while they're fighting us over here, you guys land in the other part of Africa behind them, and then we'll make us a German Africa Corps sandwich. Okay, so in November here, American and British forces are going to land in Morocco and Algeria in what's called Operation Torch. All right, and it works really to perfection. All right, other than one major counterattack here at Kasserine Pass, which really kind of catches the Americans off guard, Rommel is as outmatched and outmanned and is forced to retreat to Tunisia. Rommel himself would retreat back to Italy so that he's not captured, but his army is. All right, and his army is going to surrender here in early of 1943. So you get to add another 100,000 captured Germans in the Africa Corps to the growing tally of defeated Germans. All right, so all right, great. Right, the Americans are like, okay, we got our feet wet, we're ready to go. Let's go right at the Germans. Let's go across the channel, and the British. Germans are still really, really dangerous at this. And in fact, Winston Churchill is saying that what we need to do here is go after the Italians. The Italians are a weak partner for the Germans. They don't really have their hearts in the war. And if we attack the Italians, they'll probably pull out of the war, all right? And then we'll just be able to drive up right into southern Germany. We won't have to worry about this. And he referred to Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe. Okay, all right. So what this meant was, though, you're going to have to attack the island of Sicily. That is just off the toe of the Italian boot to use as an air base for the attack on Italy proper. And the operation of fighting here in Sicily really should have been a wake-up call for a lot of the American and British military planners that Italy wasn't going to be the easy victory that Churchill had kind of promised. Because Sicily, just like the rest of Italy, is rough, mountainous, with a limited number of roads, and it's relatively easy for a defender to stop her up the few places that you can get in and out of these areas with limited numbers of forces, and make it very, very difficult for you to just sort of run wild and sort of break through and surround them. But they do capture Sicily. There is difficult fighting, and so in September here of 1943, the Allies are going to land on the mainland of Italy at a place called Salerno. Now, on the one hand, Churchill's going to be right, and on the other hand, Churchill's going to be wrong. All right? Politically, he's dead on right. The Italians, it turns out, are fed up with being involved in a losing war. They're going to rebel against Mussolini's government. They're going to capture this guy. They're going to put him in a little mountaintop prison. They're going to first ask for peace from the Allies, and then shortly thereafter, they are going to turn around after they've got a new government, and they're going to declare war on Germany. All right? Now, Hitler has a lot of problems, but insane idiocy is not one of them. He understood the fact that the Italians may pull out on him and may switch sides, because they weren't really, winning the war. They didn't really have his sort of drive for world domination. He's going to free Mussolini and set him up now as the puppet government, and basically he's going to take over the rest of Italy that he has control of with his army. So Italy is essentially going to be in two parts. The part controlled by the Allies is the part that's on the American side. The part that's still controlled by the German army is the part that's still under Mussolini's control, because the Germans are allowing him to be in charge of this. So as the Allies move forward, the Allied part of Germany grows, or Italy grows, and the fascist part shrinks. But what you're going to see here is the fighting in Sicily is largely repeated, right? There's brutal fighting all in and around the mountains because these limited number of mountain passes and roads are relatively easy for the German army to stop her up with a limited number of forces. And it turns out that this, swift drive into southern Germany is a long, slow, bloody slog up the peninsula that is really going to last until the spring of 1945 because the invasion or the drive northward is going to be really, really unsuccessful. So these are the torch landings on the coast of North Africa. Generally speaking, they were uncontested. And then eventually the Allies are going to drive inland. They're coming here from the west, and you're going to see that the Germans are going to be retreating back to the east. And the final lines are going to be right around Tunis here and in eastern Tunisia as well. These are the husky landings. The Americans in the west, the British in the east, and they're going to push forward and eventually drive the Germans out, but not until after heavy, heavy fighting as a result of the operations in Sicily. And this is the Americans are splashing ashore at Salerno, and this is the event that would eventually force the Italian government to switch teams and kick out Mussolini. But this is a good example here of the fighting in Italy. This is a nice little three-quarters view that was done of one of these. This is the Liri Valley with Monte Cassino here in the middle. And these are some Brits that are fighting here around Monte Cassino. And this is just a good example, the Liri Valley campaign, of how difficult it is. You get these narrow little gorges that, just a few Germans in these elevated positions with machine guns and other things can stop her up a lot of these mountain passes. And this is what it looks like, these high observation positions, with them raining fire down on American and British troops trying to capture this. And these little plastic warriors up here give you a good example of what fighting in Italy is like. These guys have a lot of advantages. They got semi-automatic rifles, they got radios, they got a machine gun, they even have a little light tank with them. And you say, well, not a lot's going to be able to stop these guys. One guy with an MG42 machine gun and maybe a Panzerschreck or a Panzerfaust anti-tank device, and they can stop her up this whole pass. And the only way to get around it is, hey Bill, stick your head out, see if the Germans are there. It is really, really dangerous stuff, and it's just going to slow down the Allies point by point all throughout the Italian peninsula. And here you can see this little map that would have been published in the newspapers to give you an idea just kind of how slow this slog is. These guys land here around Salerno in September of 1943. It's not until almost a year later that they get halfway up the peninsula to Rome. And so it's just going to take these guys a long, long time to reach their destination. And so the United States military planners had been talked out of a direct sort of assault against Germany several times by this point. The British had said, no, these guys are too dangerous. We can't go after them. But finally, Italy's surrender, not leading to defeat for Germany, gives the Americans enough kind of oomph at the bargaining table to get with their allies, the British, and say, look, we're going to have to go after the Germans straight ahead, okay? We're going to have to then invade German-occupied France in order to do this, right? But it's easy to say that, difficult to actually do this, because this means an amphibious landing. And amphibious landings, where you take guys, from ships, and you put them on a little landing craft, and then you put the landing craft up to the beach where you start to get shot at, and then they got to get off on the beach where there's no cover, and they got to go attack an entrenched enemy. This is extremely difficult. Okay, this is the most difficult type of operation that you can do in modern warfare. And so the Allies don't hop into this over the course of a weekend. They understand that this is going to take quite some time. And they begin building up supplies and training troops, getting them running through these exercises again and again for what would turn out to be the largest invasion of human history. 3 million men, Americans, British, Canadians, and a few French, under the command of the American General Dwight David Eisenhower, are going to hit the French coast at Normandy on June 6th of 1944. Technically, the invasion began the night before because 3 parachute divisions, guys, airborne troopers, are going to drop out of airplanes and in gliders. 2 American and 1 British are going to land in the French countryside behind the German lines the night before in order to block up reinforcements reaching certain crossroads, to capture certain bridges across rivers. And so what we're going to see here is the rest of the invasion, though, is going to come in a straight-ahead manner. There's no room for maneuver. There's no way to be fancy and avoid heavy casualties. It's going to be massive, massive losses in parts of this because these guys are exposed. Despite the fact that you get pretty bad losses in some of the sectors, the Allied plan is going to work. It's going to work, all right? The problem is, once they get up and on top of the cliffs that are guarding a lot of these beaches, there are Germans still beyond that. Right behind this is going to be the Normandy bocage country, where you've got some real difficult terrain. You got these high hedgerows, these sunken roads, you got these fields that are completely surrounded by these hedges, and so it's extremely difficult to try to move through this area because, again, just a few Germans, 1 tank here and there can stop her up an entire crossroads area. And so 2 more months of hard fighting, and finally the American Air Force is going to blast a hole through this, and George Patton and his Third Army are finally going to break loose here into the more open areas outside of Normandy in the rest of France with his Third Army. So once you get out of Normandy area, you're going to see that the Allies' massive numerical superiority is going to create a big problem for the Germans. The Germans are racing to get out of France. The Allies are racing to catch up to the Germans and prevent them from reaching the security of Germany. And so it's throughout much of the latter half of 1942, you're going to see big sort of sweeping advances. And they're going to be liberating occupied cities in France, in Belgium, Luxembourg, a lot of these places very, very quickly. But by December of 1944, the Allies are forced to stop because of the extremely long supply lines. The further that they get from their bases, the longer it takes to bring up food and especially gasoline to keep the vehicles running, and so the Allies are going to have to stop. So this is an overall look here of Normandy, of the major sort of beach positions. You've got 3 kind of main areas. You've got Utah in the west, you've got Omaha, and this is really kind of the most difficult of the 3 areas, and these are both Americans, all right, these are both American beaches, and then you've got the British and the Canadians and the British that are going to be at Gold Juno and Sword beaches, along with a small contingent of French in the east. And so this is what you would have seen the night before, right? These American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropping on this. This is Saint-Merry-Glace. This is the first French city liberated by American forces of the 101st Airborne Division in 1944, and this is them posing for a photo. But most of these guys are going to have to go in on these Higgins boats. Open top, little wooden craft. The door's going to open, and you're going to start taking machine gun fire. And you've got to get up and out of this thing, into the out of the water, up onto the beaches, and fight your way inland as quickly as possible. These are the Canadians that are crawling their way ashore at their beaches here in the east, and so it's extremely difficult for really everybody involved. There's a great little action scene at the first sort of half hour of the film Saving Private Ryan, which came out in 1998, that nothing really gives you a better sort of view of what the fighting here at D-Day was like other than that. This is an actual photo, though, of what the beach looks like. Very different than what we might see if you go to the beach here in Florida. You've got some cliffs in the background. You've got long sort of stretches of open terrain. And, of course, the Germans are all dug in here on the side of these cliffs, and they're pouring down, rifle, machine gun, and mortar fire at these guys. And they're going to kill a lot of these guys. Once you get beyond that, though, this is the Normandy hedgerow country. Extremely difficult to try to move through with large forces. You can't just swing through wherever because of the hedgerows that are difficult to penetrate. Eventually, American ingenuity would start cutting these through. They would start cutting up some of these German metal defenses that they had used at the beaches and then weld them to the front of their tanks and use them like plows and start cutting through some of these to maneuver around a little bit. And this is eventually what's going to take place here. American bombers are going to blast a hole through part of the German line. As I mentioned, Patton's Third Army is going to break out here in the southern sector of the fighting here, and eventually they're going to start fanning out all over the place, and they're going to start sweeping around and capturing these German forces. And this is what it looks like. The Americans are helping to liberate Paris, and this is them liberating another town here in northern France. And of course, you got a lot of the girls are coming out, and they're happy to see these guys, and they're getting smooched. And of course, one of the major problems these guys had to deal with: clear the streets. We're going after the Germans. We know you're happy to see us, but get out of the way, please. All right. So by December 1944, everything's looking rosy. Right. I mean, you got the Germans are on the defense everywhere. You get the Russians that are on the Germans' eastern border, right? Because the Red Army had been on the advance all throughout 1944 as well. And then, of course, you get the Brits and the Americans, and they're on Germany's western border, and they're just sort of knocking at the door. And so it looks like, we'll have a little Christmas holiday, and then, we'll get back to things in springtime. We'll smash the Germans, war will be over, no problem, right? The problem was here that Hitler really wasn't hip to that game. And what he had done throughout most of 1944 was he had carefully husbanded his last resources, and he managed to put together 3 panzer armies as one sort of last military strike force. The question was, what are we going to use them against? Now, logic might tell you, say, look, listen, Adolf, the war's lost. We're not going to win the war. Who would we rather lose to, the Russians or the Western Allies? And if that's your question, right, if you sort of assume a certain amount of rational reasonableness, you'd say, well, we'd really rather lose to the Western Allies. They guys are democracies, they're republics. They're not going to treat us very badly. Whereas the Russians, they're communists, they hate us. That one, they'll institute communism, and 2, they'll probably blow up the whole country because they're pissed at us for invading their country. Let's lose to the Americans. So let's send these guys against the Russians, drive the Russians back as far as we can, and then just let the Allies, the Western Allies, in. That would probably be best case scenario given this. But Hitler is still thinking, I think I can win the war. I think I can win the war. What's the best way to win the war? Okay. Well, the Western Allies have a lot less land area that they're in charge of, and if we attack them via the same route that we did in 1940, we may be able to split their line, and then once we can drive those guys off the continent and have to force them to retreat back to England, then we can turn all of our forces in the West back against the Russians, and hopefully then win the war there as well. If that sounds like a long gamble where you've got to roll a bunch of sixes in a row, that's because that's what it is, all right? So he decided that he's going to unleash these guys on the Western Allies through the Ardennes Forest using a very, very similar plan that they used in 1940. Now, to be fair, Hitler's army has a couple of advantages. One is surprise. The Americans don't know that this is coming, okay? And they catch the Western Allies completely off guard as a result of that. We're also going to see here that the weather at this point is such that the planes can't take off very easily. There's a lot of cloud cover, there's a lot of bad conditions, and so the fact that the German Air Force has largely been shot down by this point doesn't really matter because the Allied Air Forces can't get up in the air to shoot at the German tanks that are on the ground because they can't get up in the air at all. And so the fact that the German Air Force is kind of gone, doesn't really matter a whole lot. And so this advantage that the Allies have in air power by this point of the war is nullified for most of the battle by the weather. And so what we're going to see here is the blow generally is going to fall against the Americans, and the surprise and the shock of this here is going to drive a giant bulge in the American line. However, what we're going to see here is, unlike what we saw in 1940, is the Allied line is going to bend but not break. The Germans are going to push, but they're not going to break through. And eventually we'll see that these guys form these little units. For example, the 82nd Airborne is going to go in, or the 101st Airborne is going to go into here. And they're going to get surrounded by the Germans at a place called Bastogne, but they won't give up fighting. And this is going to slow the Germans down, and everything that they do everywhere is going to slow the Germans down until eventually a couple of things happen. One, Hitler's tanks are going to start running out of gas. The Allied bombing campaign was really taking a heavy toll on German fuel reserves, and then as they stop the Germans and they're fighting these battles, eventually the Allied aircraft are going to get up because the weather clears, and they're going to start bombing stew out of these stalled German tanks. And so what we're going to see is eventually the Allies are going to push the Germans all the way back to the start line where they had been at the beginning of the battle. But the difference is, of course, now Hitler's military advantages, the troops that he had thrown into this are either killed or captured as a result of the fighting here in the Battle of the Bulge. This is a video game, right? You can learn a lot from video games of one of these attacks because a lot of the tanks and stuff that Hitler had on hand were pretty modern. You got some Panther tanks, some Tiger tanks, some Panzer IVs, some Stug assault guns that he's able to throw into this fighting that takes place here. But the Americans refused to give up, and they would form these little ad hoc units as best as they could, even though their units were getting kind of shattered and broken up into these little pieces, and they refused to run off the battlefield. They'd fight these Germans, and they'd pull back a little bit, and you'd fight them some more. And the idea was just hold them as long as you could with this until finally the weather's going to clear and the tanks are going to run out of gas, and we're going to see major devastation as a result of this. And so here, the map overall gives you an idea of why it's referred to as the Battle of the Bulge, right? Because there's this giant bulge in the line that these Germans are going to advance through, but they do get stopped along this front, and they can't advance anymore. So when the spring of 1945 does roll around, this is going to be very much the end for Germany. The Allies are going to move into Germany from the east with the Russians and from the west with the British and the French. And so at this point, huge numbers of Germans realize, okay, the game's over, right? No sense in dying. There'll be a few fanatical, SS kind of units that'll rush into, machine gun fire, Heil Hitler, and they're kind of nuts. But for the most part, the average workaday German, we lost the war. War's over. We lost. All right, time to surrender. And so you're going to see huge chunks of the German army begin surrendering, and the British and the U.S. are going to overrun the western two-thirds of the territory, while the Russians are going to capture the eastern third, which is going to include, though, the capital of Germany, which is Berlin. Now, just as bad as the Battle of Stalingrad was, actually the bloodiest battle of the war was the Battle of Berlin. The Germans refused to give it up. The Russians, of course, refused to let the Germans hold on to it, and both of them fought doggedly to capture or hold the German capital, but eventually the Russians would win after all of this, and so this is the situation by the end of the war. During this, though, is when the Allies are going to discover the full horror of what is going to be taking place here in Germany. One, you've got the destruction of the German homeland. One, by the fighting, and two, by the Allied bombing. It's one thing to hear about it on a map. It's another thing to walk through some of these towns that have been turned into these giant piles of smoking rubble. More importantly, what we're going to also see is the Allies are going to be the ones to go through and liberate these death camps that Hitler had set up for this final solution, the Holocaust, as we would refer to it as. The answer that Hitler said to the Jewish question. He hated Jewish people. What do we do about them? They don't really belong here in Europe. His plan was to kill them all. That was his plan, okay? And Hitler was going to be very systematic about the whole thing, and he would put them into these death camps, all right? And you're going to see 6 million of these people are going to perish in the Holocaust that were Jewish, and another 12 million total, and 6 million of them were Jews. And the Americans, they come in and they see this kind of stuff, right? So Hitler decides that he doesn't want to be a prisoner of war, right? So he puts a bullet through his brain, and he's going to allow other people to surrender for him. And that's exactly what's going to happen here in May of 1945, which is sometimes referred to as Victory in Europe Day, right? Now, FDR, for his part, he doesn't live to see it. He is elected to a fourth term in 1944. He would be inaugurated again here in 1945, but he would die of a stroke in the spring of 1945 in April, and so he doesn't live to see victory in World War II. So here you see Americans, they're marching their way through the Siegfried Line in the west, and here you can see on the right is Russian tanks on the streets of Berlin with the Soviet flag flying over the Reichstag building. And so this is what a lot of Germany looked like. Bombed out, fought over, not much left of it at the end of World War II. We got some disturbing images here with the Holocaust, but these Jews are being forced into these internment camps that eventually turn into death camps. Piles and piles and piles of these bodies in these mass graves are what these American soldiers would run into. People that had been starved to death, where they were essentially just skeletons with a little bit of skin stretched over them. So horror of horrors as a result of that. So the United States, though, is still at war with Japan. While Germany and Italy have been knocked out of the war, what about the Japanese? Well, throughout this period, right, we mentioned island hopping. They were clawing their way closer and closer to the Japanese home island. During the reinvasion of the Philippines, we're going to see that the last major remnant of the Japanese fleet is going to engage in a gun battle with the U.S. Navy forces that are supporting MacArthur's invasion forces on land at the Battle of Manila Bay and Surigao Strait. And it's going to be a big, nasty, sort of explosive affair. But long story short, we're going to see that the American Navy is going to prevail here. And this is going to be a major victory for the United States. So now from this point forward, the United States has total naval superiority. They can go wherever they want on the water, and essentially the Japanese can't stop them. And they're going to be advancing closer and closer to Japan. And the next stop here on the island hopping campaign is the island of Iwo Jima. And the closer that, unlike what you'll see with the Germans, which is kind of the closer the Allies get to Berlin, the more the Germans are, okay, war's over, I'm going to start surrendering, all right? The Japanese sort of have the inverse of that. The closer that the Americans get to the Japanese home islands, the more fanatic they get in their resistance. They're going to fight from these caves, they're going to fight from these bunkers, and they are going to cost the Marines 4,000 dead in taking Iwo Jima. The next place to advance here is Okinawa, and Okinawa is kind of set off and separate and apart here from Japan, but is actually technically part of the Japanese home islands. And they need this as an air base for the attack on the Japanese mainland itself. Again, we're going to see the Japanese are going to resist beyond what anybody could possibly expect, beyond all reason. And the operation is going to cost 50,000 casualties for the U.S. Army, right? Also, we're going to see, for the first time at Okinawa, the systematic use of the Japanese suicide pilots that are sometimes referred to as the kamikaze, right? The divine wind that was going to turn back the Allied war effort. And these guys, what they do is they load their plane down with bombs, and the plane itself is a bomb, and they would just fly it into these American ships, knowing that they're not going to get out of this. The U.S. Media at this point, they would tell the Americans back home, yeah, they're hitting us with this. But it's not really causing that many problems, and of course this shows how desperate the Japanese are getting. The reality of this was this was extremely deadly, and it was causing a lot of problems for the United States Navy. The attack sank 30 ships or badly damaged over 250 ships in the U.S. fleet at this point. So this was a problem. This was a big problem for the United States, unlike what they were telling people. And so this is the lineup of U.S. battleships here at the Battle of Surigao Strait. You'll notice that they get to cross the T, where most of their guns are going to be employed against the Japanese, who are forced to come in like this against them, and so they get hit with concave fire from the maximum number of guns in the U.S. fleet as a result of that. These are the Marines going forward in their amphibious tracked vehicles at the invasion here at Okinawa, and they will make it ashore fairly okay, but you can see here Mount Fujikawa in the background of them taking fire from all over the place. There's caves here, all in this area, and of course the Marines, you can see they're starting to pile up with the dead in the foreground. And this is them pinned down on the beach, this the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, and they're sort of working their way forwards, blasting these guys out with flamethrowers and hand grenades, and these Japanese guys are going to fight to the death. And this is them, one of the most famous photos in all of American history. These are the Marines raising the U.S. flag on Mount Suribachi in Iwo Jima, and this is them sort of proclaiming kind of victory. The fighting would actually go on a while after this, but the fact that the United States was able to get to the top of this was an important moment in the battle. And you can see the damage caused by wrecked ships, wrecked Amtrak's, dead guys, blown up equipment all on the shore. So this was not a cheap victory. And of course, the U.S. Army is going to experience the same kind of thing of this difficult fighting of these hidden hidden Japanese all over the place at Okinawa as well. This is a gun cam footage of a kamikaze about to strike into an American ship here. Like I said, extremely dangerous and of course psychologically damaging, right, to a lot of these sailors, because you never know when one of these things are going to hit. And you can see the massive damage caused by this. Not only is the plane going to explode, but of course it's loaded down with bombs that are going to explode as well, right? Well, as I mentioned, the Japanese defenses, the United States gets closer, gets more and more fanatical, right? And as the United States gets word that the Japanese are arming their entire civilian population, that the Emperor of Japan says, hey, look, everybody's going to fight. Everybody's going to fight and repel the American invasion. There's no reason, okay, for the United States to doubt that they're going to do this. So not only are they going to have to fight now the Japanese army, but they're going to have to fight like everybody in Japan. Little kids, old people, cripples in the hospital, that they're all going to be getting some kind of weapon and they're going to come out and they're going to fight the Americans. Would that have happened? Maybe, maybe not. All right. The Americans have to take this very, very seriously. Okay. So the United States faces the daunting task of trying to invade the Japanese home islands themselves. Right. Now, the new U.S. president here has been FDR's vice president. That's Harry Truman. Right. Now, Truman, he gets with his military planners and say, okay, look, here's the deal, President Truman. When we invade the islands of Japan, we've got this military plan worked out. Of course, one of the questions that President Truman wants to know, because he's president of the American people, how many casualties can we expect? And they tell him, this may cost us 1 million casualties. 1 million? That's not, no. You guys must have done the math wrong on that. You must have been like, you must have put the decimal in the wrong place. You mean like 100,000 casualties? No, sir. We think it could be as high as 1 million. And of course, if you've got American soldiers versus Japanese, if you say that one American soldier could, if they're fighting like partially unarmed, partially untrained Japanese civilians, you say the kill rate may be like 1 to 20, 1 to 10, like 10 to 20 million dead Japanese. Truman is going to seek a different solution then. All right. One of the other things that they had come to him about once he had assumed the presidency was the Manhattan Project. Right. This was a scientific endeavor that had begun early in the days of World War II. And, of course, the idea behind this was to produce nuclear weapons. This was an idea that Einstein had kind of come up with, and some other guys like Oppenheimer and a few people had pitched in on and said, yeah, if we split an atom, okay, you can release insane amounts of energy as a result of that. And finally, the Manhattan Project, they had produced 3 of these bombs, and they were going to use one of them on the Germans during the Battle of Bulge, and then finally somebody said, hey, maybe we ought to test this and see what it does. So they're going to test one of them, and they're going to realize maybe it was a good idea we didn't drop this on superpopulated Europe as a result of this. So they got 2 tested bombs here by 1945. So when Japan refused to surrender, Truman ordered that these bombs be sent to the Pacific to be used on Japan to force them to surrender. But also, Truman doesn't trust the Soviet Union. Soviets, these guys are communists. They're sort of like fascists too. They've got a dictatorial kind of government. I don't know about these guys. And so this was designed also to send a message to the Soviets that, hey, we've got a super weapon, and you may not want to mess with us in the post-war period. So on August 6th, 1945, the bomber, the Enola Gay, is going to drop 1 atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The city is annihilated, okay? 180,000 people are going to die instantaneously or over the course of radiation poisoning for the next few months. Well, I don't know about, what your response might be if this were to happen. We don't know today because it hasn't happened in our lifetimes for the most part. Japan, their response is not, oh, well, what do we do about this? They're dropping nukes on us. We need to stop. Try to surrender. The first question that Hirohito had was, hey, how long is it going to take us to get a bomb like that? completely detached from reality at this point. So when Japan drags its feet and they don't immediately try to surrender, 3 days later Truman is going to order a second atomic bomb to be dropped on Nagasaki. And Nagasaki itself is going to be obliterated as well. Finally, the Japanese get the hint and they surrender unconditionally. Of course, the United States had dropped its entire nuclear arsenal on the Japanese. But at this point, World War II is over. This is the mushroom cloud that appeared over what had been Hiroshima in Japan, and this is the one that appeared over Nagasaki in Japan. And then this is the Japanese members of their government surrendering to the United States forces on the deck of the USS Missouri. And then there is a great deal of elation all throughout the United States that the war was over, that no more fighting would be required. So that is going to end the U.S.'s involvement in World War II, and that's going to end our